So good morning, everybody. I'm John Mitchell, and I currently work in the National Accounts Division within the Statistics and Data Directorate at the OECD. And I just want to say thank you very much to Cliodhna, who sort of invited me to come and as Anaïs said, just provide a little bit of context to some of the work that's about to take place or has already started to take place within the ONS. And so thank you very much for that. This is actually the second time I've presented at ESCO, and it's also the second time I've presented on the digital supply use tables. I'd like to think that we have made a few developments since last time, which was 3 years ago. And I'll also, because of that, 3 years ago, I really spoke much more about the conceptual framework. And pleasingly, I'm able to show today a little bit more some tangible results that countries have actually undertaken to start produce this work. So just to provide a little bit of background, on the Secretariat, or my area is the Secretariat of the Informal Advisory Group on Measuring GDP in a Digitalised Economy. This is a very long title, which is why it just gets referred to as the Advisory Group. And it's a subset of the Working Party on National Accounts within the OECD. And this group was set up to really focus on measuring digitalisation and the research agenda for the revision to the SNA. This particular work, the digital supply use tables, has really evolved from a rough abstract in 2018 to now being part of the SNA research agenda. And recently it was endorsed that it doesn't become part of the new core accounts of the SNA, but that it is included in a revised SNA as one way that statistical officers can look to try and make digitalisation more visible in the national accounts, which is really what we're trying to do. Several countries have already started releasing some estimates consistent with this framework, and I'll get to that a little bit later. And as we can see, at the most recent G20 Digital Ministerial, we encourage improved measurement of the digital economy. That's not necessarily a surprise, but it's nice to see that this is still being reaffirmed. So there is still a strong user demand for this work. I do want to caveat, I suppose, producing official statistics takes time. That's not news to really anyone in this audience. Measuring the economy is hard. That's also not news to anyone in this audience. And so I suppose, 3 years ago when I presented the framework, you might like to think, oh, well, now every country in the OECD is producing these estimates. Unfortunately, that's not the case. This framework has really been done via consensus within the OECD. It's paramount that we get buy-in from the countries, as ultimately they're the ones that will need to produce these estimates and seek their source data. So it's no good us just implementing, saying, go and do something. We need to work with the NSOs. And as I said, that does take time. So I've got there the COVID tents in front of the magnificent Parisian architecture. If you need to put a building up to administer some COVID testing or COVID vaccine, a tent is your answer. But what we're looking to do is something a little bit more sustainable. And as I've put there, the most difficult estimate to produce is the first one. So what we have seen, though, with Canada so far, is that once they're able to estimate it, the idea of being able to roll these out every year is obviously becomes easier. So it is a slow process to begin with, but I do feel that we are moving in the right direction. There's the framework. If only I had $1 for every time I've been able to present this over the last 3 or 4 years. For those that it's new to this, I would probably suggest that what we're really focusing on here is the how, is the nature of the transaction. So the digitally ordered or delivered, and then the digitally delivered. What we're really trying to get away from is just delineating a certain product as digital or not digital, or delineating a certain industry or unit as digital and not digital, because we know that there's a large digitalization aspect with all products in the economy, not necessarily the way they're made, but the way that they're ordered and delivered. And so this is why we felt that this was the appropriate way of trying to come up with some new indicators that would reveal or make digitalization more visible, which is essentially what we're continually aiming to do. So this is linked to supply use tables. Again, we thought that this was the way to go, is that rather than trying to build a new estimate, we're going to break down estimates that most statistical officers are already producing. And so most OECD countries produce supply use tables on a regular basis. And so considering that most of the value add is already inherently in these tables, we're really focusing on a reallocation rather than a creation of new statistics. And so the framework contains additional rows for aggregation of digital products, as well as explicitly identifying some other digital products such as cloud and digital intermediary or digital intermediation service. We have additional industries which really delineate digital industries, as we would like to call, which is less about the underlying activity and more about how the units are leveraging off digitalization. And in my next slide, I'll sort of make a very crude demonstration of this, and in that you have the traditional ISIC or NACE industries, transport, admin services, retail, accommodation, and you have these units that might be placed in those based on their underlying activity. But what we really want to show is, okay, if the retailer is actually more of an e-tailer, well, let's separate them out. If the firm is relying on a platform to generate demand, so let's separate them out, as opposed to a firm that is still relying on a traditional business model. As I said, this is still very crude, but this is where we sort of feel like all the data is inherently already within the statistical officers. It's just the way that we're cutting it up, so to speak. So the digital supply use tables doesn't favour a single definition of the digital economy. There is a lot of work on what the digital economy is. As I point out in some of the papers, 70 years, there's still debate about exactly what the economy is in terms of what should be within GDP. So I feel that is a battle not worth exploring. And so rather what the digital supply use tables is, it focuses on providing a suite of indicators. And they cover things such as digitally ordered, digital consumption, trade, so digital import and export of digital services. As I mentioned there, value added by digital industries as opposed to the underlying activities, and also the role of digital intermediation, which we feel is particularly important over the last 5 to 10 years and likely to be more so into the future. So unlike most other presentations here, I'm not going to be presenting my own work. I'm going to be presenting the work of others, which is always easier. So as mentioned, a couple of statistical officers have already produced a few estimates. I will add that conceptually, the additional breakdown of rows for digitally ordered, digitally delivered could happen for every single product in the supply use tables. We are certainly not expecting that countries are going to do that for all 88 products or thereabouts. So we've identified some key high priority indicators that we feel is where countries should aim their resources for early on, to try and come up with some initial estimates that can be compared early on without then saying, okay, and now can you please do that for coal mining? You know, we know that there's not a lot of digitally delivery of coal mining, and so we're really focusing on particular indicators. So in April of last year, Statistics Canada released their initial estimates of digital supply use tables. So here's the industry viewpoint, and you can see that they released estimates for 3 years. Just as we would recommend that countries look to do, they gathered a range of indicators from a variety of data sources, both surveys that they already were undertaking, admin data, tax data, a real scavenger hunt, and then applied this to break up rows and columns of their conventional supply use tables. So what I'll highlight today, I guess, there is digital intermediary platforms. So, I mean, I did contemplate asking what percentage of value add do you think digital intermediary platforms are within the Canadian economy? But you can see there it's 0.2%. Now, we know that that's not exhaustive because the way that they undertake the production of these estimates is still, as I said, a bit of a scavenger hunt and then applying it to certain industries. But what we will see there is, okay, growth of 37% and 34%. And logically, you know, that makes a lot of sense. If we think that the digital intermediaries are playing a larger role going into the future, then it's very important that we are able to put some numbers to them. Now, these are experimental estimates, and I don't have any. I expect that most countries, when they produce these, will be experimental to begin with. But again, having some numbers that Statistics Canada are willing to put their name to, I think is a really important step in the right direction. You'll notice there as well. So we've got e-tailers and other producers operating digitally. The other producers operating digitally is really a catch-all for digital-only firms that don't fit any other categories. Again, we know that that's probably a lot less than actually is, because it is relying on the indicator information that Statistics Canada are able to do. If we move on to the digitally ordered, digitally delivered, so the more product view or transactional view of the Canadian outputs, again, you can see here that they've got a split between those that ordered direct with the firm and the amount that was ordered via a third party, the digital intermediary platform. And then importantly, you've got digitally delivered imports as well. Complementary to the digital supply use tables is another area of work within the OECD, the Handbook on Measurement of Digital Trade, with the idea that measuring digital trade is under the same foundation of services, goods that are digitally ordered or digitally delivered, with the digital trader then able to fit into the supply use tables overall. So late last year, the Netherlands released some estimates under the same on the same sort of consistency with the supply use tables. The Dutch provided a lot of information in their paper. If you are interested in this work, I strongly recommend that you read it. They really outlined the indicators. I use the term microdata incorrectly, but that indicator data that they are then applying to the macro supply use tables. So it's really impressive the work that they've done in terms of trying to come up with or navigate challenges of how they come up with these indicators. The digital intermediary platforms, I'll just touch on quickly here, that they actually did some machine learning to try and identify platforms. So essentially, they taught a computer to scroll through a whole bunch of Dutch websites and identify terminology and characteristics of that website that identified it as a platform. So from that, they then took those names, compared it to the tax data, and were able to create essentially a business register of intermediary platforms, which they then were able to send out a specific survey for. Now, again, I don't expect every country to be able to do that within the next 12 to 18 months, but I guess what it really goes to is that by having a goal, we then allow the countries to come up with source data as they can, based on their sort of statistical and tax infrastructure, as well as, you know, how many resources are available to them. So the United States have been producing a digital economy satellite account for several years now. Initially, it was very much a product-based, where they delineated certain products as digital, and then they calculated the value add of producing those products. They have each year, they've slowly moved to try and become more consistent with the digital supply use table framework, and by identifying certain products and trying to change the focus slightly more on that transaction basis. But I certainly wouldn't say that they are producing estimates that are consistent with it. However, some of the estimates they do produce are consistent with it. And so you can see here that they recently, just only a couple of weeks ago, put out a time series on cloud computing, which again, not a surprise that cloud computing is growing significantly quicker than the overall economy. But as people in this room will know, it's very nice to be able to prove the obvious with some numbers. So how does this go when we combine it all together? And again, it's important to say that these estimates have been created independently. As far as I know, the Netherlands didn't come over and just say, oh, Statistics Canada, what did you get for e-tailers? Oh, that sounds like a good number. So this gives us some ability to try and see whether or not countries have comparable. So you'll see here, cloud computing services is relatively even in terms of the output of that product as a percentage of total output. The total digital products, again, quite similar. I imagine there is just a little bit of scope difference between the Netherlands and the USA in digital products, but overall it's quite close. And then the price digital services is essentially ICT goods and services, and they're in the same ballpark. When we look at it from an industry point of view, now, as I said, the USA have got the asterisks because this is not, they haven't moved units over into the new digital industries, as I spoke about earlier. Rather, these are products that they've delineated as digital being created by these industries. So the USA is slightly different. But again, this ability to be able to compare countries is really important to try and quality assure the work and be able to provide a little bit more evidence for policy. So am I going for 5? Excellent, thanks. So I will just quickly touch on a little bit more boring area of the work in terms of the formalization of it, because we get away from numbers. But I suppose I do want to show that the interest in this work is high. So as part of the incorporation into a revised system of national accounts, a global consultation was undertaken on the digital supply use tables, as it has been undertaken on a range of research areas for the revised SNA. And so what that really showed is next 3 to 5 years, do you intend to compile estimates that are somewhat consistent with the digital supply use table? There's a lot of yes there. Now, maybe these countries are particularly optimistic. Maybe they're doing a whole bunch of work that they haven't told me. But I'm pleased to see that people are valuing the work and would like to undertake it. Now, again, no news here that resources are always tight in statistical offices, and this is essentially additional work. And so, it is hard for them to find resources to devote to this. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it does take time. Finding source data, making the source data of appropriate quality to apply takes time. However, there is a gap in the market when it comes to digitalization and national accounts. And so does your country currently undertake any alternative approaches? Well, there's a lot of no's there. Now, a lot of countries, I'd say most countries, are putting out some kind of estimates of digitalization, whether or not it's e-tailing, it's an ICT use survey or something along those lines. But applying those within the scope of national accounts, which is, in my view, quite important for allowing for that comparability, and ultimately users want to know how much of that is of the total economy is really important that we bring that consistently back to a national accounts. So, some final considerations, a bit like the framework. If I had $1 every time I said that digital SUTs are not the panacea, it's a step in the right direction. There's certainly, I would love to be able to say, here is a definitive number. This is how countries compile it, and here is a range of estimates of digital economy across the world. That's not going to happen overnight. I really do think that, as mentioned, there's a lot of work that is happening to build a strong foundation to being able to implement digital supply use tables in the future. And what I like to contrast it with is probably distributions of national accounts, in that 10, 15 years ago, some people were doing distributions, but it was extremely experimental. It was perhaps more in academia rather than statistical offices. And this work has suddenly, built momentum as more countries produce these estimates. Other countries are able to see the value of them. And then they begin to devote extra resources to it as well. And just like the digital supply use tables, the hardest distribution to produce is the first one. But once it is, you have the framework set up, and it's quite easy to then roll it over the next year. So I do honestly believe that the digital supply use tables will be able to provide a lot of useful information. And obviously, the more that countries are able to produce and the more countries are able to produce them, the more valuable they'll be. So with that, I'll leave it there.
Really interesting stuff. So for me, it was, if I've understood correctly, this is essentially a framework where you say economy, we know it produces, we know. So we're saying we know an economy produces X, and then off that X, it percentages enabled for the digital economy. So it's not focusing on is there additional output being produced, both from a level and a trend effect. So I was just wondering, from the work, whether it be Canada, Netherlands, the US, or other examples, is there a feeling that there's actually additional output that will be captured through this framework because we just don't do it very well? And or do you think it's more of a price effect, that is the price of these digital output that's falling a lot faster? And so when you think about measuring the modern economy or the new economy, whatever you want to call it, that's where some of that additional output potentially is. Thanks.
So I'll touch on the second aspect there, that the price effect, this really is focused on current prices right now. And so the volume indicators that have been produced have not necessarily been produced with new price indexes. And so if they're splitting a column or they're splitting a row, they're using the same indexes. So I think that is certainly an area that can be explored further, is that the idea that a t-shirt bought online probably has a different price index to the one bought in the high street has a lot of legs. And I think that is something that we would encourage statistical officers to explore, but I don't think they're there yet. So in terms of the feedback, I know Statistics Canada certainly took some learnings from it that they introduced back into the supply use table. It was certainly not additional output. And so we can have an hour and a half on whether or not the supply use tables is catching all the economy or not. But I think we've certainly approached it from a let's assume that it is, and let's reallocate that. Now, what I haven't spoken about here, just because of time, is that the framework does contain additional rows that are currently outside the SNA production boundary regarding data, regarding free services or putting a value on free services, with the idea that these can then feed into a broader digital economy satellite account. Now, this presentation I've just focused within the production boundary. So I guess that is not necessarily adding output, but it's adding additional value, I suppose, that the digital economy might be creating.
Thank you for a really interesting presentation, John. I had a question about the Canadian table you showed us. There was a separate line for advertising-based platforms, I think. And that was really small compared to the digital intermediary platform. So presumably it's not Google and TikTok, it's something else that's being captured there? Yeah,
well, I mean, theoretically, Google and TikTok would be captured there. Now, whether or not Google and TikTok are in the Canadian accounts or whether or not they're importing that service, I don't know. But theoretically, that category contains social media. So the idea that if you are providing a service and not charging for it, and that you're generating revenue from either selling data that you're collecting or by selling the advertising space, that's the category for it. And it's specifically set up for those kind of companies. Now, would love for the US to come up with this table and try and put some values to that. But yeah, we'll still wait. But we wanted to have a home for it because we didn't want it to just get incorporated in with advertising services or wherever Google might get placed.
Hi, there's some estimates about from the e-commerce survey of Eurostat and ONS. I was wondering how some of this compares with those. They have questions about what share of your turnover is like through e-commerce or digital sources.
Yep.
So if you could give us some sense of how these benchmark against those.
Yep. So we haven't done that ourselves. But when I speak to countries, again, it's this is much more trying to suggest to countries that they should undertake this work rather than undertaking it ourselves. But the e-commerce survey is the clear point that we direct people at and say, okay, it may not be 100% in scope with household consumption, but we think that it's got a pretty good scope match with some of the categories of household consumption. And so can we use that as an indicator to break up some of the estimates of the broader estimates? So it's not so much more how they would contrast. What we're really encouraging countries to use is use that and apply it to something that is on a national account basis. So.
Thank you. That was a really interesting talk. However many times you've been through the framework, I don't think I've heard it talked about quite like this before. So I think it was really helpful. I guess I wanted to ask what might be a slightly unfair big picture question. So if I put you on the spot and ask you in 40 years' time, will we still be producing digital supply use tables with, for example, online retailers and wholesalers? Yeah. The kind of question I've got in the back of my mind is, suppose we'd had these, the mechanisms we've got today and the discussion groups we have today, when the internal combustion engine was coming along, would there have been a kind of a push for a internal combustion engine supply use table where we look at how much production is moving over to this new general purpose technology? Do you see what I mean? As it becomes more ubiquitous, the need for this separate set might diminish. So that's my kind of question.
Yeah.
What's the longevity, do you think, of this?
Phil, that's a very, very fair question. And it's not the first time it's been asked. And I guess my answer would be in 40 years' time, I hope we don't need to do these because we have all kinds of fancy, data collection and distribution mechanisms in place. What I will say is that some components of it, I think, have a longer longevity than others. I'm involved, and other people in this room may be involved within the Isaac revision. Now, I pushed very hard to try and create a separate category for intermediation services with the idea that if it's a separate category, NSOs are somewhat compelled to identify intermediation services. Now, it wasn't taken up, but some of this somewhat preempts work that you are expecting to see in official classifications further on. So cloud is another example. So within the CPC, cloud isn't mentioned at all. Now, in the revised CPC, I would bet anything that cloud is going to be mentioned. And so we're not going to need to try and delineate it from existing products as is outlined in this framework. So theoretically, coming up with a cloud estimate is going to be easier in 5 years' time than it is today. However, when this is first started and until all countries implement the CPC framework, how do we find out what cloud is? So I guess I think that the longevity is enough that it warrants doing some of this work, even if ultimately the full thing is never produced consistently by all countries, in 40 years' time. And just to go finally on that idea that it lays a framework for digital economy satellite account is that countries can take the components that are useful to them or that is of particular policy interest. They can then add the components that they might like free services or public digital goods, or they cannot. And so what it really does is just a sort of building block that allows countries to sort of expand as they like. So I'm happy to keep going, but I think, yeah. Yeah.
Great. So hello, I'm Cliodhna from ONS, and I'm going to be building a bit on what John's talked about and talk about what we've been doing in the UK, working towards this framework. So I'm going to start off by really spelling out what we see as our digital measurement horizon. John spelled out the framework for us, which really underlies that, but I'm really referring to it here as a bit of a horizon, as the journey that we're having in completing the digital supply use tables is very much a process of learning as we're going along and engaging in stakeholder feedback. And so we're going to talk a little bit as we go along about what we've learned and how that's changed, how we see our journey going forwards. And that's going to be a very ongoing process. So we'll talk a bit about that. And then we'll get into the guts of the event, and we'll talk about how we plan to actually fill in this framework. And this is going to be both a backwards focusing and a forward focusing exercise. We'll talk a bit about the work that we've done so far, but also talk about the work that we have in progress and how we see that fitting in. And then the work that we haven't yet really been able to get to the crux of, but that we have started setting in motion. That's going to go through existing data sources, the new digital economy survey that we set up, and then talk about the use of big and administrative data. And then at the end there, we'll get to those points that we've learned along the way. So just starting off, what I thought might be helpful here is John there's lots of ways of presenting this framework to try and slim it down, because there's an awful lot that you could do to get into the nitty gritty of it. But I've sort of tried to show a simplified version of what the supply side version of this table would look like, so that then I can paint this picture, and I will do it quite literally with some colors. But you can see that we've got a amended supply table here. On the rows, we've got products, and we've got a block here at the top as specifically digital products, broken down into ICT goods, digital services, cloud, and DIPs. Then below, we've got our more traditional CPA products as we use them in the UK. And then at the bottom, we've also got some products that lie outside of the production boundary. So, for example, free digital products and data that, as John said, countries might be interested in. And then along the rows, we've got those digital industries that John talked about, as well as the traditional SIC industries. And as this is an expansion of the traditional supply tables, I've just coloured in grey the bits that we already have from the supply use table. So we already have totals for the products being produced, and we have that the totals of output for the industries, as well as that matrix in the bottom right-hand corner for the what is the domestic output table of what products are produced by which industries. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to populate this table. But as John said as well, each of these products in these rows can be broken down further into the digitally ordered, breaking that down into whether it's from a counterparty as well as the non-digitally ordered, and there's a digitally delivered as well here. So I'll go through, and as I paint this, I'll also try and point out when we'll get data in about whether products are digitally ordered and digitally delivered. But for simplicity, that will come as a little bit of a footnote. So just to talk about what we quite like about this, and this builds on one of the questions that we had earlier. One of the things that we find quite advantageous about this is the flexibility that this has. It incorporates dimensions and features which might not really be acceptable within our core accounts, but are still of quite applicable use to our users and our stakeholders. The digitally ordered and digitally delivered is a really good example. And as those new dimensions and features come along, this gives us a way of, just thinking about how we incorporate those and how we think of them, and how we can present a number that is conceptually consistent and coherent with the national accounts. So you can give it as a percentage of the whole economy number. But also it's quite nice in that similar way that it incorporates both activity that goes on within the production boundary, but also for us, we are quite interested in work in activity going on outside of the production boundary. Last year, I presented on, for example, the thinking that ONS had been doing about free digital products, which I won't be going into so much today. But it's nice having a framework there where we could incorporate that work and present it as part of this bigger picture. And at the end of the day as well, this is a framework that we're quite familiar with and builds upon it, the supply and use tables. So moving on then, so in order to fill in this table, we have quite a few different areas of research, all which we're going away and working on and bringing together within this. So we're exploring the use of existing data sources. We're exploring the use of traditional ways of collecting new data, so the development of a new digital economy survey. But we've also been doing work into researching the use of financial transactions data in order to be able to populate this table. And then finally, I also want to touch on the specific, we see digital trade as being quite a key area of interest, which we're giving specific focus to. So I'm going to go through these bit by bit. So the bit that we have been doing, the existing data sources. So I want to run through the methodology that we've been using. It's quite a simple methodology, but it's, as John said, it's our starting point. And it really gives us the foundation from which we're then going to complicate things as we bring more things in. So to begin with, we're using existing data sources from the ProdCom and from the annual survey of goods and services to get information of sales for different products that we're going to use as our starting point. And I've demonstrated some illustrative data so you can see how this works on the right-hand side. So we have very detailed product categories that were taken from the OECD guidelines on defining digital products. And these are at a sort of 4-digit and 5-digit level, but I've just simplified it on the right-hand side. So we're taking those data as they come directly from the surveys, and then we're constraining them to more aggregate figures that we get from the supply and use tables, specifically the supply table. So again, on the right-hand side there, we're merging on those aggregates from the supply tables and just constraining our numbers. So as you can see, I've sort of demonstrated it here that for the most part, these numbers are very similar, but it accounts in a way for any conceptual differences or slight methodological differences, as the supply use tables do use richer data sources and slightly more complicated methodologies than the survey data itself. So that gives us on the right-hand side some measures of output by product categories at a low level that are therefore conceptually much more similar to the supply tables. And then again, using the supply use tables, we merge on data from the domestic supply table. For those who aren't familiar, that is the table that for the domestic economy, it details which products are produced by which industries. So you get something like the colored table that I've shown on the right-hand side. And for those who have looked at it, we tend to talk about on-diagonal and off-diagonal production. So industry A, think about something like agriculture, will primarily produce agricultural products, but in the process of doing its work, it may produce some other products. So you'll get this off-diagonal production, but the majority of production will lie on that diagonal. So we then use this table, and that's at a bit more of an aggregated level. So for example, you can see industry A there, think of something like agriculture again, or in this case, a manufacturing aggregate. And that may have 2 products attached to it that we're going to use. So we then use that matrix to calculate which of, for these low-level products, the proportions of them we think are going to be produced by which of these industries. And again, that I've translated that on the right-hand side to sort of show how that would work. So again, you can see the majority of them go on that diagonal production. But one of the key things about doing this and why it's rather useful is the focus that we can then do in analysis on that off-diagonal production, what digital products are being produced by which industries which we might not expect, and then we can dig down into that a little bit. So then that gives us output for the digital economy, which we can break down by industry, which is then useful for the final step, that we can use those tables again using the intermediate consumption table from the supply use tables to look at for each of those industries a proportion of output to GVA, so accounting for intermediate consumption, to translate that output into GVA that we can then aggregate across the industries to give us total digital economy GVA or digital product GVA. So a rather simple methodology, but it lays the groundwork then of incorporating the supply use tables within this that we can build upon in the future. So just to show you then what that means within those tables. So this gives us the ability to fill in some of these green areas. And in light of thinking about the comparisons with other countries and what they've been able to produce. So for us so far, using this methodology, we've been able to think about ICT goods, digital services and cloud services, but holding off for the time being on digital intermediary platforms. So we have the majority of digital products, but we are missing that one component. And as well as giving us totals for output, it enables us to also look at the matrix of which industries produce those products as well. But as the little caveat at the bottom right-hand corner, there's no digitally ordered or digitally delivered breakdown from this yet. So what do the data look like? And I want to give my thanks at this point to my co-author, Laura Avram, who worked with me on this, and we published it in January this year. So one of the key charts that we're able to produce and the data we'll be able to produce is this chart that's on the right-hand side. You might not be able to see it too well in the room here. What this shows is for the year 2019, it shows gross value added by different industries. So the total of the stacked bars are the GVA for each of those industries. But in addition, we can break it down into which of that is non-digital product GVA and which is digital product GVA, as well as adding in a specific bar for digital products as if they were in an industry. So you can compare the size of this specific definition of the digital economy to other areas. And you can see that the size as it is rather similar to other industries. So for example, it's very similar in size to digital and storage, to transport and storage, as well as public administration and defense. But you can also see exactly which industries are producing these digital products. So, for example, information and communication, about 50% of its GVA is coming from digital products. But again, this is where things are useful because actually quite a big chunk of output in this area is not non-digital according to this definition. So we can start looking at this extra detail. But then, of course, we can aggregate the figures and just have a look at the trends over time. So we've been able to do this for 4 years so far. And one of the things that we found quite surprising at first is the stability of these figures over time. So this tends to be in the UK for the 4 years, we have around 4.6% of GVA for the UK economy. And one of the things that we wanted to point out with this, and John alluded to it a bit earlier, so we started with current price data so far. So one of the areas that we're quite interested to look in the future is producing chain volume measures or other volume measures. But the difficulty with that comes with the prices. And we want to give some extra thought of how we compile deflators that will give an accurate and useful picture on this. But our sort of intuition is what might be going on, given the industry information that we have, that a big chunk of digital products are produced by the telecoms industry, for example, is that in the UK, we know that there's been quite substantial deflation in the communications industry over time, which would mean that if you were to use the deflator from telecoms for a good chunk of this, you would see quite strong volume growth. So we're aware that while the digital economy may be a fairly constant proportion of GVA over time, that could still be consistent with volume growth. It's an area we don't know about yet. So that's talked about the sort of work that we've done so far. But the next thing that we have on the horizon is a development that we've been doing of a new digital economy survey. So in 2021, we took the opportunity to transform our e-commerce survey into what we're now calling a digital economy survey. And that comes with an expansion of the sort of data that we're collecting in there. And one of the big areas that we're collecting new data is the sort of data that we're going to be using to be able to populate the digital supply use tables. So in particular, asking questions about the purchases and sales, which are digitally ordered and digitally delivered, as well as information about digital intermediary platforms and other data. And so just to give people a timeline of when we're going to have results on this. So we're out collecting data at the moment. Results are going to be published in December of 2022. An example of what those sort of questions look like, just to give you a more concrete idea in your head. So question 24 of the survey, for example, is going to ask people for the turnover from e-commerce sales to customers located outside the UK, breaking that down, and then other information, for example, about the purchases of goods. And so that's going to enable us to be able to produce data on these orange areas. So you can see that we can start having information about those digital industries, as well as populating the full array of digital products. But it isn't going to be able to, at that aggregate level, the sort of granularity that we get from a survey, enable us to produce some of these cross tabulations that we're going to be interested in. So that's where the next bit of work comes in, the big and admin data. So this is very much still in the early days, but we're interested in the use of financial transactions data in order to be able to populate this. So this is information we have about business-to-business purchases and business-to-consumer purchases from financial transactions. And there's a lot of work to be done in terms of taking that data and having a look, for example, at the coverage that data has, how we can pull out information about which products they're associated with, and comparing it to our survey information to have a look how consistent they are. And we published around 2 to 3 weeks ago a article detailing some of the work we've done on this so far. But in the future, we're planning to use this in order to be able to produce some of those cross tabulations. So at the aggregate level, using the conceptually stronger survey data to be able to give us some of our aggregates. And then where we're aware that there are more conceptual issues, but there's that more granularity, we're going to tie those two together to be able to use the granularity from the admin data, to be able to break down some of those totals from the survey data, to be able to populate some of those cross tabulations. And I should note with these that this would also hopefully give us a breakdown for digitally ordered and digitally delivered, at least at for those aggregate totals. And the final thing that I want to mention there on the work that we're doing is around the digital trade that again, we've put out an article about 2 to 3 weeks ago, just detailing some of the key start to the research we've been doing this area, having a particular focus on digital intermediary platforms and trade associated with those is going to be one of the areas of challenge, but that we want to give particular focus to as a result. But that also we are going to be looking to produce estimates of digital trade that will be consistent with this framework later in 2022. So my final slide, in the process of doing this, it's given us a real opportunity to think about these digital supply use tables and start engaging with users, giving them the foundation that we've produced so far, and discussing that roadmap that we have going forwards. One of the things that we have come across is that there's an interest in quite a few areas for the digital economy that are evolving incredibly quickly. So we have concepts that are thrown around like the sharing economy or the platform economy, and these come into fashion and go out of fashion rather quickly. Some of them stick around, some of them don't. And having the flexible framework in which we can incorporate them will be rather useful. So for us personally so far, what we're thinking about looking into is the potential for using the digital supply use framework as a framework where we could incorporate some of these for the short periods in which they're useful, having a core bit of the framework that will be constant and consistent over time. For example, the digital products that are consistent with the CPA categories, then also using it as a flexible framework to sort of show how there are overlaps between these different competing concepts. You know, bringing in something like the sharing economy or the platform economy and showing how that overlaps with these other different definitions that we have of the digital economy. And we see this as potentially being a fruitful avenue, either in addition to or as a alternative to thinking about things in a more broad and abstract way. For example, one of the categories that's been talked about is digitally affected products. And it's one that we did look at for our research recently. There's some guidance out there about which products are digitally affected. But for example, that guidance included the entirety of education services as being digitally affected, but none of health services, which during particular points in time, I could see arguments for it, I could see arguments against it, but just such a broad concept can be a bit unhelpful to users. And we see having these more specific definitions about something like the sharing economy, which has a specific idea of how these areas of the economy are being digitally affected, could be a more productive way of incorporating them into the framework. And that finishes things. So yes, any questions?
Thanks very much. I figured out to wait for the microphone this time. I thought it was really fascinating, your work, and it seemed like the focus so far has been on domestic supply in understanding the digital economy. And I was just wondering if you think in the future we need to consider the use side or not. And I suppose it's both from, I mean, I'm guessing a lot of it is in what's household consumption, but I'm thinking also intermediate consumption by businesses, but also what we export. And I was just wondering if that's being picked up in the survey designs you're doing, or if that's almost next stage you want to focus on how we understand the digital economy just from a pure domestic type supply. Thanks.
No, so I mean, it is an incredibly good point, and for the sake of time here, as well as because it's where our research began, I focused mostly on the supply side. But for example, the digital economy survey will be asking questions about the purchases of products. And we are in touch with the household team in ONS to think about how we can incorporate household purchases so that we can populate the use side of the table as well. And I, of course, mentioned that we are taking it forward as a separate project almost, but connected to think about the digital trade. There's slightly different guidance around digital trade at the moment, which one of the areas that we're trying to look at is just ensuring harmonization, that we can respond both to some of the specific work that's going on around digital trade and the guidance that's available, as well as connecting it to this digital supply use framework. I think obviously in the future, the goal is that countries will be producing these data and they'll be consistent. I still think there's a bit of research that needs to go into doing that we're looking at the moment. But yes, so through that we would get estimates. We're planning to publish some initial ones towards the end of this year about using these categories of digital products, digital imports and digital exports.
Thank you, Cliodhna. It's really interesting work. I wanted to pick up on that last point about education. On the chart you showed earlier, that was a non-digital sector. Is that something that we should expect to change if we have another year like 2020, when a lot of the activity went online? Would you expect that to be picked up?
So, I mean, that's exactly the sort of area where the framework is really useful and for thinking about the ways in which it will be digital. So the categorizations I showed originally were the rather narrow definition of purely digital products. The paper that we published in January includes these categories of digitally affected products, which include education services. But once we get information from, or once we start populating this table for digitally ordered and digitally delivered services, we could have a look specifically at the amount of digitally delivered education services, which would pick up that exact point of, you know, thinking about the move towards education being delivered through things like Zoom and whatnot. So it's exactly where this framework is useful, being able to think what's the definition that people have in mind when they're talking about digitalization. If it's the fact that education is digital because it's being delivered digitally, you can have a look at the proportion that it is. If you're interested in education being ordered digitally, you could break that down, all these sorts of things. So the product categories that we have don't include education as being digital, and that isn't really being thought about as being changed. But once we do incorporate digitally ordered and digitally delivered, it's the sort of area we might see a breakdown of it.
Thanks, Cliodhna. I've said this privately, but I can say it publicly. I'm obviously very encouraged by all the work that the ONS is doing, so congratulations on it so far. Just to pick up on Sumit's point earlier, I agree with him that if you've looked at the digital products and applied them to the traditional industries from an output point of view, I do wonder if it's relatively low-hanging fruit to take those same products and apply them to the intermediate consumption of those industries. Because when we've spoken to countries, we have sort of recommended that this is an easier implementation because the data is already in the house. And that is something that I think would resonate with a lot of people is, okay, what industries are consuming more ICT goods over time, as you know, as a sort of a representation of moving more digital. Yeah, I think that that sort of complements that initial first stage that you've done. That would just be a comment from me. But overall, it's excellent work, and I look forward to seeing it keep coming to fruition.
No, and just to respond to that, I definitely agree. And it's one of the, as I hope I've shown, in terms of populating the digital supply use tables, it is very much not just been a singular project for us as an ONS. We've had them as a unifying framework to think about digitalization in quite a few frames, but looking into the intermediate consumption is one of the areas where we do have a potential project going forwards. For the exact reason that you've mentioned, and potentially is using that as a way of defining a definition of digitally affected. It would be specifically which of those areas that cross certain thresholds, the amount of intermediate consumption that's coming from digitally affected products, or similarly for investment, things like these that we could have a more consistent or objective or scientific or whatever you would want to call it way of defining these. But also to come on that, the approach that we've been taking with the digital supply use tables as well is really because of wanting to use it as an opportunity to engage with users. We've been trying to go with, we're aware that as a project, this is going to be a rather long project. And it's very much a research project. So we've been taking a policy of, we're doing a lot of work consistently in the background. We're getting results almost constantly with these overlapping projects. We're really taking snapshots at point in time of publishing what we have so far. So the idea at the moment is that we will have roughly annual publications. So the next one should be coming out something like January next year, where we'll take the work that we've been able to develop so far and showcase it, talk about the work that we still have in progress, and talk about how the roadmap that we have for the future has changed. So still engaging with users. So that's something that I hope that we might have for a future publication soon. It's something that I'm personally working on during my time at work. So yes, hopefully watch this space.
Thank you so much. I think it's really interesting, and it's also really good to see so many new things happening. I want to ask a question about digital trade. Do you think that the way that you have redesigned and re-implement the digital economy survey relative to the old e-commerce is a step further to what OECD countries have already have, and in some areas it might bring some breakthroughs because measuring digital trade is always very challenging? And is that completely based on the firm level survey, and then you aggregate to the economy? And would that allow a good measure at the firm level digital trade activities? And in what way that might be, you know, a breakthrough compared to what's already there in the OECD? Thanks.
So my knowledge of what other countries is doing is probably a little inferior to John's. So I might pass over to him to talk perhaps at the end about what other countries are doing. But what I am aware of is the fact that the digital economy survey and the questions that we're asking are quite novel internationally. And one of the things that we're very interested to do with the development of this survey is really to test a lot of questions. A lot of these haven't been asked before. And so as well as a process of collecting data and being useful for that, we're also seeing it as an area of research just for data collection in and of itself, what works, what doesn't work. And it's something that we might build upon in the future. So while I definitely want to celebrate the innovativeness of what we have in ONS, in terms of the digital economy survey, and we'll be using that data, it is also going to be the first step of collecting this data, and we're going to take and have a look at what works and what doesn't work, how we can improve those questions going forward, and having a look at the quality of the data. And obviously it's something I'm very interested in microdata research myself and looking at the business level. So it's something that where the researchers do use the e-commerce survey for this purpose. So I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to use it for those purposes. But I do also want to be open and transparent about the fact that we're being experimental with this, and it's something that we will build upon in the future.
I can't drive the mouse. There we go. So thank you everybody for being ESCO diehards and attending the Friday morning session. This is a bit of a change of gear compared to the first two presentations, because I'm not talking about putting the data together, but about using some of it, and in particular using the old e-commerce survey. And I want to give due credit to my colleagues on this paper, Kieran Lind, David Nian and Manuel Tong. And I have to say it's the first time I've presented it. They've been presenting it so far. We're very much at the stage of collecting comments and feedback, and we'll be revising the paper shortly. And so what we wanted to do was actually test this kind of quite fundamental issue. And if I move on to the motivation, we're all very familiar with the slowdown in productivity growth since the mid-2000s, loads of evidence now on that across the OECD. Also, another stylized fact emerging from a lot of the literature is that the gap in productivity between frontier firms and the rest has been increasing over time. And this is a bit of a puzzle, because it's over this period that we've seen an explosion in the use of digital tools of different kinds in production. The amount of data that's used, the explosion of cloud services, the development of platform business models. So everywhere you look, we can see digital tools being used in production. And there are different potential explanations for this. One of those that has a lot of traction is that actually it's all being used, but what it's being used for isn't very productive compared to previous eras of innovation. But another alternative is this productivity J-curve concept, that when you first start using these digital tools, you need to learn how to do it, and it might need reorganization by the firm, it might need some complementary investments, so it's not an easy thing to do. And the hypothesis then is that it starts with a few firms and takes time to spread gains to most other firms. So a lot of the literature has looked at the US, some of it's been cross OECD, and we wanted to dig into this for the UK data. The obvious thing to do would be to do some growth accounting, but that actually just deepens the productivity puzzle. If you're adding in inputs that you think were omitted before, so if we want to account for more digital inputs than had been used before, and those inputs are being used more now than previously, then doing that in a growth accounting framework is only going to give you a bigger puzzle in the end. That framework also assumes perfect competition and constant returns to scale. That's very much not the situation in the context of digital technologies. And so we decided to take a production function approach. There's every reason to believe that using innovative new tools will increase productivity. There's a lot of evidence about the social returns to innovation. I've cited the Jones and Summers paper on this slide, but actually all the way back to Robert Fogel and the railroads, the social returns for innovation are high. There's a growing literature about the role of digital capital or intangibles more generally in contributing to productivity at the firm level. So for example, using digital capital, using predictive analytics and data, but also this pattern of superstar firms increasing concentration and higher productivity, but only among the leading firms, so that wedge opening up between the frontier and the rest. And then a literature actually dates back all the way to the early 2000s about the role of organizational capital in being able to use the digital tools properly. And Erik Brynjolfsson has, over the years, been at the frontier of that kind of work. So we're going to focus on the UK. We're going to use the e-commerce survey to look at a large number of digital inputs. And we're going to apply a production function estimation approach using TFP estimates that take account of new kinds of digital capital stocks. And I must say, a lot of the work on this paper has been putting the data together. We merged 3 ONS data sets, this is the first time it's been done as far as we know. A lot of work to link across these surveys, annual business survey, annual purchases survey for spending on different kinds of digital type inputs, and then the e-commerce survey. Those of you who use it will know, but others might not, that a lot of the questions in the e-commerce survey are about the extensive margin. Do you use this or not? So they're 0, 1, not so much about the intensive margin. Merging these gives us a bias towards larger firms. And we end up coming down from the 62,000 to the 11,000 to around 2,000 firms a year. So it's absolutely not representative. And you can see from the figures here that the average firm in the data set is very, very much larger than the average firm in the UK population of businesses. And we also had to exclude a few outliers. That wasn't the end of it. Linking the surveys was the start. We also then had to create capital stocks for the physical capital variables, but also the intangible capital variables that we're adding. A standard method, perpetual inventory method, building on the ONS data for the conventional capital stocks up to 2014, carried these forward, and did a similar method for the intangibles, which were R&D, programming, telecommunications, etc. We took the depreciation rates in the EU CLEMS data set, and we assumed a 5-year average life. And then we constructed 2 kinds of capital stock measures, 2 kinds of TFP measures, total factor productivity measures, one the conventional one, and one total factor productivity using these new capital stock measures. And the regression results that I'll be reporting later are using the new alternative TFP measure. And then we tried different standard approaches to estimation that are widely used in the literature. the differences are not very large between the different estimation methods, and we settled on the Wooldridge method, which is seems to be emerging as the favorite in the literature and gave us a little bit more stable and robust results. So that's the setup. And just to start with some descriptions, what this chart gives you are the size of the company by employment, and this is 2018 figures, and the spending on these different kinds of digital related capitals. And you can see, as you would expect, that very large firms spend more, and that's somewhat more proportionately as well as in absolute terms. And there are no clear trends over the time frame that we have, which is 2015 onwards, except that smaller firms on the whole did increase their spending on these different kinds of digital capitals over that period. But among the bigger firms, there wasn't a clear trend in proportionate terms. So that's just the basic data. And anybody who's interested, all of this is of course in the appendix to the paper. We had to put the firms into bins so as not to be disclosive. These are some charts just showing you basic descriptive indicators. This is the correlation between labor productivity and the proportion and the proportionate use of different digital adoption indicators. So the left-hand panel here is employees who got access to the internet at work, and the right-hand panel here is what proportion of the values of the orders for your company come through the website. And across all of the indicators, there's a positive correlation. And so firms that use more of these different digital measures have higher labor productivity. So that's one of the basic descriptors. We then divided them into adopters and non-adopters. As I said, a lot of these e-commerce indicators are 0, 1. So if it's a 1, you count as an adopter for that digital indicator. And then we looked at labor productivity, dividing firms into adopters and non-adopters. So these charts give you labor productivity logged, and they give you employment size on the horizontal axis, so larger firms to the right. And as you might anticipate, for these particular indicators, which are businesses employing ICT specialists on the left and using cloud computing services on the right, the adopters have a higher level of labor productivity than the non-adopters. Although interestingly, the slope of these lines is negative, so somewhat lower for the larger firms, a bit of a surprise. But that's what you might have anticipated. You use the technology, you've got a higher level of labor productivity. But that's not consistent across all of the indicators. And so here on the left, you get external suppliers to maintain your IT. And on the right, you get your external suppliers to support your office software. And here, the non-adopters have a higher level of productivity than the adopters. So this was a first surprise and something that we wanted to understand a bit better. As I mentioned at the start, a lot of the literature now divides companies into leaders and laggards. And so we constructed the TFP measures, and we took the top 5% of firms by total factor productivity and looked at what the difference was between the leaders and the laggards. And so here I've got size of firm and total factor productivity. And you can see that, as you would expect, TFP is higher for the leaders than for the laggards. Surprisingly, in this data, the gap seems to be narrowing for the very largest companies, and also has that downward slope. But again, the size, the fact that the leaders are ahead of the laggards, that's exactly what we would expect. The gap between 2015 and 2017, we find hasn't changed very much here. For other papers in this kind of literature, there seems to be evidence of a growing gap. So that's something that might need digging into a bit more. That's all the basic descriptive stuff, and a lot of it is what you would expect. But the surprise is that there were some e-commerce survey indicators for which non-adopters had higher labour productivity than adopters. And so that's something to explore in the estimation. We use instrumental variables approach, and the instruments were the share of firms adopting the technology by year, industry, and TFP quintile, which is pretty standard. And we had to do something different for ratio variables in the e-commerce survey. At a later stage, we also introduced some new variables. One is single digital, has the firm adopted one of these digital measures? Another is multiple digital, have they adopted more than one type? And then a variable that ranges between 0 and 6, depending on which of 6 digital technologies that are positive related to TFP in our first stage regressions. So OLS results, I'll skip because that just tells you what the correlations are. And so here are the basic results. We tried a panel and we tried single years. The panel results are somewhat unstable, and there's an a priori reason for preferring single years if you believe that firm markups, particularly among the bigger firms, have changed over that time. So there'd be a rising markup that differed by different sizes of firms over time. And so this is a table showing you the estimation results for 2017. So a lot of these variables are highly significant. And but again, you've got that mix of positive signs and negative signs. So this is the kind of surprise finding that's emerging from all of this. Don't know how well you can see it in the room, but for example, using cloud computing, very strongly positive, but getting your ICT maintained externally, very strongly negative. And so this division between the things that you do in-house in the firm and the things that you buy in, get external suppliers to do, it seems robust. It's not just in the raw descriptive statistics, it's in the estimation results as well. So that seems to be an interesting and robust finding. And then we added the additional variables that I just described to you, and using multiple digital tools, again, strongly positive result, and the number of digital tools that you use, again, a strong positive result. So this is adding up to a picture where there's a distinction between having in-house capabilities and buying services in externally. And the more adept you are and the more of these tools that you use, that more that contributes to total factor productivity. So it's a unique data set. And of course, we heard from Cliodhna that the survey is going to change and we'll get much more information about intensive margin use, which will be really interesting. But we think this is the first time that the e-commerce survey has been linked to UK firms in this way. So we can look at a really large range of digital tools. The unsurprising news is that large firms are more digital intensive, have higher productivity, that digital adopters for the in-house tools also have higher productivity than non-adopters. But it's better to be a non-adopter if you're thinking about some of these external services. Using multiple in-house digital technologies, strongly positive related to total factor productivity. So this seems to add up to a picture confirming the idea of the productivity J-curve, that it's not just as straightforward as buying a digital service. You've got to know how to use it, and building those capabilities in-house seems to be important. So I think further explanation, taking account of organizational capabilities, would be interesting. Obviously, using the new data when that comes through is going to be really interesting. I said right at the start, we had a bias towards larger firms. I think understanding small firms will also be important. And from other work, it's pretty clear that small firms divide into two categories, kind of traditional small firms, if you like, and startups that are digitally native, that go straight towards using cloud services. And for other firms, this question about when do you cross that non-digital native to digital native threshold, and what does that imply for management skills? In other work that I've done since, and that Peter Goodridge is presenting in the other room that I would be at if I weren't here, there seems to be a story about the slowdown in productivity growth being most pronounced in leading sectors that are knowledge intensive, and that we think of as UK success stories, like pharmaceuticals or computer software. And I think, again, this adds up to a picture where understanding what's going on in firms in terms of their organizational capabilities and how they use these tools is going to be really important. So that's it in terms of the presentation. But if anybody has any suggestions for improving this or questions, I'm very happy to take them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting paper. I want to ask you how likely it is that a firm that is more productive is actually outsourcing, or instead, keeping in-house digital services. So could it be that there is a self-selection bias there, so that more productive firms are actually keeping in-house rather than outsourcing the digital services?
So yes, of course, there's that challenge, and that was the idea of using the estimator that we did. The data set has got its limitations, and I think you only really get to that kind of question by doing a non-econometric work, actually, and going to do some case studies or some qualitative work with those kinds of firms to understand it. I don't think you can ever really identify it through this kind of work.
You can probably guess what I'm going to ask, Diane, which is about open source software, because I expect people at DeepMind aren't paying for data licenses. So how much does this capture open source software? Is it just maybe included in the cloud provision, or is there something missing in the regressions there?
It doesn't capture it. It's not measured in the survey, so it's not directly included. I would expect there to be a strong overlap between cloud use and open source software use. Updating some of Shane Greenstein's work on open source software, I think, would be a really interesting activity. But again, understanding the difference between firms, because I think you've got to be quite a technologically sophisticated firm to use that at all, with some exceptions, and it depends what you're classing as open source software, but the DeepMind kind, there are not many companies that can do that.
I was just going to ask a bit around the transition path for firms, and I don't know whether you can see in your data about the external contractors, sort of, do firms kind of, do they use in-house first and then move to external contractors, or do you also see firms using external contractors and then switching to become in-house, and kind of understanding the preferences that they make using that kind of time dimension?
It's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer. And for the econometrics, we've been presenting the results in these bins for the obvious reasons. I'll have to go back and see whether we can actually track that over the short period that we have. I don't know, but good question.
Thank you, Diane. There was this table where you showed us that single use doesn't help as much as multiple use. And then this was, the next table where like these are growing for like people using multiple technologies. In the previous table, we saw that these things seem to be significant for many digital technologies. I was wondering if you ran a horse race between different technologies to see, because if they're using multiple technologies, it might just be like a couple of technologies which are really contributing to like TFP growth, not so much like all of these. So I was wondering if you ran a horse race ever to see which one is the one.
I can't remember, Cyril. I'll have to check back. I think so, but again, it's a good question and I'll check on that. Thank you very much. Sarah, to make you run, Maria's got one right at the top.
Thank you, Diane. That's great work. And I was wondering whether some of your puzzling and non-puzzling results might be interpreted or through the lenses of traditional economics of innovation literature, such as process and product innovation. Some of the digital investment can be related to typical labor saving, but most of them might be related to our common interest at time saving, and therefore they might be getting to new output faster and therefore being more productive. And I guess some of these results might be related also to the absorbing capacity literature. For example, those that rely on external sources might have, in fact, less absorbing capacity and therefore explain some of the negative results that you have. In other words, it would be great to perhaps distinguish between sources of labor of productivity increase. Some of them might not be cutting labor costs and so on. So just a suggestion. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Good point. I mean, you know the absorptive capacity literature much better than I do. So I'm sure that does link to this story about organizational productivity J-curves. I think the first part of your question might actually relate to Cyril's question about looking more closely at each of these individual technologies and seeing if there is what the outcome of the horse race would be between those. So I'll merge those two thoughts together.
Thanks so much. I feel bad I didn't take the microphone when I was on this row. So, you had a chart on kind of laggards versus leaders, and it was just a descriptive one. So I think it was this one. And I guess the thing I took away from it, like the gap between, I guess, the top end and the back end reduces as the firm becomes bigger, is how I'm understanding this chart. And so I was just trying to understand it from almost like a policy prescription, because if, as I said, I'm just taking, and as a descriptive one, but it's almost like saying you just need to get bigger to become more productive, which is not, that's not really, I guess, a policy prescriptive advice. So I was just wondering if there was an understanding of, and maybe this is in your conclusion slides, what would be some of the barriers here in terms of digital adoption? Is it simply just, I guess, the knowledge and the ability of firms to do that, and it's almost like a hurdle which you just have to clear, or is it something a little bit more, I don't know if it's, I can't really see if it's like a finance argument or anything like that. I just wondered if you had any views on how you would close this gap or get firms to move up the distribution.
That's interesting. So the big surprise in the paper was that there are some digital tools negatively linked to total factor productivity. A smaller surprise was that some of these lines do have negative slopes when you might have expected positive ones. I'd be a little bit wary of building too detailed a story about that, given the bias in the sample that we have and not putting too much weight on this kind of data, more than it can bear. So I would rather kind of hold off on telling that sort of story until we get more insights from the, innovation tradition in literature or more qualitative work about what's been going on in firms. And I know as economists, we like the econometrics, but actually I think marrying that with some qualitative research would be really interesting in this context. Thank you. Thank you.